NATO accused of false flag attacks in Ukraine. Coming up.
The third force in eastern Ukraine. Kiev copies George Bush's plans for Iraq. And mainstream hosts storm out of the studio.
Killing your own citizens, then blaming another nation to start wars called a false flag attack. The most infamous is Operation Himmler. Nazis murdered fellow Germans, then blamed Poland to start World War II. Nazis trained by NATO were the vile snipers during the Maidan protests who shot both sides, both the police and their own supporters. It helped spark the violence that brought the coup d'etat. Leaked images show Ukraine nationalists Una Unso being trained to use sniper rifles by NATO. These false flags, writes intelligence author F. William Engdahl, are just the latest atrocity in the documented NATO Operation Gladio. Decades of terror attacks that have killed hundreds throughout Europe have actually been funded and planned by the White House. Top-level officials in the government and the CIA have confirmed. In what Wikispooks calls the most shocking story ignored by the mainstream, Gladio is admitted by former CIA head Bill Colby to be a major operation. Operations like the massacre at Bologna rail station, which killed 85 people and injured hundreds more. EU Parliament passed a resolution condemning the terror, demanded NATO stop and carry out a full investigation. The US simply ignored it. Evidence shows this US campaign of terror continues today, notes the world's leading scholar on Gladio, Dr. Daniel Ganser. FBI whistleblower Sybil Edmonds, who ACLU calls the most gagged person in US history, revealed the CIA's actually expanded the program internationally under codename Gladio B. The same professional snipers as in Kiev, writes Global Research News, have been found shooting both sides in countries throughout the world that offer resistance to the US. Political analyst Eric Draitser joins us. Really great to talk to you. What's going on?
Who's behind the snipers? If they work in the service of Western intelligence, this is quite clear. Likely private contractors, private mercenaries who are paid to create this kind of chaos. Those who probably cut their teeth on the battlefields of Afghanistan and in Iraq, who now are essentially murderers for hire, who are sent anywhere where the United States or its allies deem necessary to create chaos. So you mentioned a couple of examples in Syria, in Ukraine, in Venezuela. We should also remember, of course, Thailand in 2010. We saw a very similar situation there. Egypt most recently as well. This is a standard tactic, create a casus belli for the United States to have a military presence for decades to come.
The world's main instigator of false flags, notes the editor of upcoming book Flashpoint in Ukraine, Dr. Stephen Lenman, is the United States. The US hasn't been threatened with a real attack in hundreds of years, writes the author of Questioning the War on Terror, Dr. Kevin Barrett. The only way to force war on its population is through terror-inducing false flags. 266 American sailors were killed on the USS Maine in Havana Harbor using the slogan, "Remember the Maine." The establishment blamed an enemy mine, then colonized Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Admiral Hyman Rickover later revealed it had nothing to do with the enemy. The explosion came from inside the ship. The entire US Joint Chiefs of Staff called for another, quote, "Remember the Maine incident" with Operation Northwoods. Declassified documents show Pentagon plans to blow up a US ship, hijack passenger planes, down an airliner from the US full of college students, wage a, quote, "terror campaign" in Miami, other cities, and Washington, D.C. The false flag attacks must be, quote, "widely publicized in mainstream media" to cause a, quote, "helpful wave of national indignation." The plans signed off by Armed Forces Chief Lyman Nemnitzer were blocked at the last minute by a horrified President Kennedy. It was opposition to out-of-control militarism, writes James Douglas in JFK and the Unspeakable, that Douglas says got Kennedy killed by the intelligence services. It is one of the versions for his assassination. Northwood's mastermind Lemnitzer was put in charge of NATO, where he, quote, hoisted the black flag of terror in Europe under Operation Gladio, notes the book Gladio, NATO's Dagger at the Heart of Europe. Kennedy's removal left the path clear for successor Lyndon Baines Johnson to return false flags to centre stage. Within less than a year, LBJ fabricated the attack that plunged the US into the Vietnam disaster. The president made up a non-existent strike on US ships in the Gulf of Tonkin and said, quote, our boys are floating in the water. The lie goaded Congress into authorizing war, killing more than 3 million Vietnamese and 58,000 US servicemen. President Bush Jr. told British Prime Minister Blair that if he couldn't get UN approval to bomb Iraq, he'd paint a US jet in UN colours and try to get it shot down over Iraq to justify invasions. In a bizarre parallel, Life News this week filmed Kiev now using these armoured helicopters with UN insignia against civilians in eastern Ukraine. These are just the false flags that are on the record and officially documented. Some are reprinted in 63 documents the government doesn't want you to read, written by Vietnam vet and former Minnesota Governor Jesse Ventura. On the few occasions mainstream media let him speak, hosts react with disdain and even storm out the studio in fury at the suggestion their government could ever do anything like that.
Oh, come off it, Jesse.
No, not oh, come off it. Wait a minute. Every war fought starts with a false flag operation.
You can't, in all seriousness, sit there and try and make out anybody...
Okay, let me ask you this, Piers. Wait a minute.
Have you read the 9/11 report, and you think it's a piece of fiction?
No, I believe everything in it. I believe... my government's never lied to me, have they? Let's see, where should we start? The Gulf of Tonkin incident? I remember our president sitting on TV telling us our boys are floating in the water, and it turned out to be false.
And because of that, you'll never believe anything.
But they lie all the time. Have you been in government? No, I have.
All right, so that's for... So I've never been in the NFL, but I could watch a football game. Yeah. All right, Jesse, take care.
He's leaving.
For the public to fall for a false flag, mainstream media lies must be coordinated and complete. When the White House lied that Syria's government did the Damascus chemical attack, the entire mainstream media swallowed it whole without asking for a shred of evidence. Last month, US intel admitted actually NATO member Turkey had false flagged the attack, which killed some 1,400 civilians, to justify invasion. Not a single mainstream outlet reported it. Turkey's leaders banned YouTube last month after leaked audio of them planning another false flag to invade Syria, reportedly egged on by John Kerry. Turkey's premier confirmed the authenticity of the tape.
I'll send 4 men from Syria. I'll make up a cause of war by ordering a missile attack on Turkey.
Many times, Kerry has said to me, okay, did you make the decision to strike?
Mainstream as one coordinated a term of art that the Turks were just innocently, quote, discussing military strategy, rather than the appalling truth that Turkey's planning a terrorist false flag on their own land as an excuse to invade Syria, apparently encouraged to commit the supreme international crime by the United States Secretary of State himself. US-backed jihadi admits they're also taught false flags to destroy mosques, then blame Syria's government.
I was originally tasked with the destruction of mosques.
You destroy the mosques so you can put the blame on the army?
Yes, if a mosque is not destroyed, we desecrate it.
The massacre of Odessa this month, reports Counterpunch, has all the signs of a classic US false flag. Shortly after, dozens of CIA spooks were discovered instructing Kiev's junta how to act in East Ukraine. Pro-Kiev thugs were sent to the city of Odessa with these red armbands. But the bloodshed was sparked by this rooftop shooter in a red armband, slaying his own side. Duly provoked, the thugs went on to torch and murder dozens of anti-fascist civilians they thought were to blame for the shooting. James Corbett of the Corbett Report joins us. Really great to see you. Why does the US establishment behave like this?
It's important to understand the establishment as a collection of psychopathic individuals, and that's not meant as some sort of metaphor. That's meant as as almost a medical diagnosis. There is a percentage of the population, it's disputed by medical experts, but somewhere between 3 and 4% is generally the figure cited, of people who have a medical condition where they are absolutely unable to feel the natural human empathy that we feel for one another and compassion that we feel for people in situations that are underprivileged or what have you, people who are in positions of pain or suffering. There is a percentage of the population that has absolutely none of those feelings, and these tend to be the people who rise into positions of power and prominence in power structures that themselves are designed specifically to inflict pain and suffering on others. So it is not a big stretch to imagine how psychopathic individuals advance in military or intelligence functions.
Tanks and armoured vehicles have now moved in to shoot more unarmed civilians. James Corbett notes these incredible atrocities seem intentional to justify NATO military intervention. Right on cue, this week Kiev officially asked for international military help in eastern Ukraine. The author of Questioning the War on Terror, Dr. Kevin Barrett, joins us. Really great to see you. What are the conclusions from Northwoods to Operation Gladio today?
We're learning more and more about how psychopathic so many of our leaders are and have been. Stories about Lyndon Johnson that I can't repeat on international media because they're so disgusting. Stories about the Bush family involving the worst, most despicable kinds of crime. It's become supremely obvious that a lot of the Western leadership is deeply corrupt. And I think that has a terrible effect on the larger society because it's natural for people to imitate those above them in the social hierarchy. So we, I think, need to rethink the process that we're using to put people into leadership positions, military leadership, intelligence leadership, political leadership, and we need to think about coming up with a way to maybe administer psychopathy tests to people who are aspiring leaders, or otherwise vet people to try to make sure that people in the top positions have some kind of conscience, because if they don't, I'm afraid things are going to just spiral out of control. Whole societies will become so corrupt that they will fall apart, and civilization itself will be threatened.
Dr. Barrett knows false flags only work when the public's unaware of them. Washington's blog reports that interest in false flags has gone through the roof, and interest is now highest in the US. Audiences for mainstream pumping false flag lies are in freefall. Channels like MSNBC shed half their entire viewership last year, losing another quarter just in the first 3 months of 2014. NATO leaders are now known to have mass murdered their own civilians in false flag operations like Gladio. Reportedly, the operation continues today. How many more victims will there be before the public finds out? Seek truth from facts. This is The Truth Seeker.